Hey there. Good to see you. We're looking at our weapon right here. And our weapon has this little idle floating animation on it. And in the previous video in this series, we looked at quite a bit of complex, simple things adding together, to make a complex system to have this weapon move around on the back and give it some bob and ebb and flow depending on what the player input is. So today I want to show you how I made this animation with ControlRig, and I simplified the setup. I still have the old setup, and there'll be another video series or another video in the series that talks about those other setups. Because I tried two more setups, and I went with this simpler approach. It's going to look complex, but it's not. So hopefully I can break that down for you in a simple way so that we understand what we're looking for and what we have. So we have the weapon bobbing around as the character, as our little hero girl is running around. And I'm not doing any fancy setups for, let me zoom out here a little bit. So we're sprinting and then um, let me replay this. My montages weren't working. Okay. So if we sprint, we slide, we roll, um, we dash. I'm not doing anything different for all those other modes. If like we fly and we glide here, there's nothing that I'm doing different here with all those other states that I am for just like normal movement and aim offsets and all that sort of stuff. So one of the reasons why I ditched the last setup in the previous videos in the series is that it was just becoming really complex, and I wanted a basically a catch-all that handled. I just want to say that felt good to me 100% of the time, and anything that felt like a snafu, I could just kind of live with. With the other setup, it felt like most of the most of the different states needed their own slight variation in this particular setup. So let's review what I've got. I'll walk through how I created it. We might even go ahead and create it from scratch too. All right, let's get started. So we're in our control rig that we have set up from the previous videos. And you can see this is my previous setup. And I made some functions to just basically make this an easier flow to look through. We'll go through that in a second. Here's a new setup with some new variables I created from um, the player blueprint and brought those through our animation blueprint, and we'll show that too. But this right here, I know it looks big, but this is our current setup. And for all intents and purposes, it's basically just a couple nodes. So if we come here and we pull this out, and we've got our, which weapon is it, or which control or bone is it? It's our weapon sheath bone. So we're going to get this, we're going to set it, and then we're going to use our controller here. So our controller is parented to the spine 05. And I believe I'm using the weapon sheath 02 as a guide, but it's obviously not exactly there. So I've offset it a little bit from the body. And then if we select the controller, you can see how in the shape details, I've modified what the shape is to kind of mimic, I guess, the length of the weapon. So we come here, we pull that controller out and we get it. Then we're going to expand our transform, and we're going to take our rotation. I'm going to say 2 Euler, and actually we're just going to do this specifically. Spring interp here on rotation. We're going to pull out our translation, do the same thing, spring interp, For our translation, let's move these up. Bring in our result here. And then we're not going to do anything with scale. And that is more or less the overall setup. That is our foundation here. So here, if we take our values, we have a 3 and a 0.5 on that spring interp, and we're using the same on the translation spring interp. So let's play. So what we won't get is the animation that we created, but we will get some bobbing. And you can see you get a little bit of a subtle bob as it tries to ease into whatever location and whatever rotation that we're going to. Let me zoom in. So if we sprint, slide, roll, and dash, we can see that more or less the weapon is doing something cool. It's just doing some, as animators would say, some overlapping action. And then we'll glide. And then you can play with those settings too. So if we drop that down to 2, drop this down to 0.25 on both. Then you'll be able to see that it should be a lot looser. So it just depends on like how much springiness you want in the sway or the bob of your weapon on the back. So cool. So that's our overall setup. Or I should say the foundation to our setup. So the next thing that we're doing here, and I know this looks complicated, but we are doing some idle animation stuff over here. So let's go ahead and bring this out and try to recreate that. So first we want the accumulate time. Yeah, that's it. Accumulate time. Yep. And then we want the modulo. So what this does, we're going to use this essentially. This is like essentially creating a timeline for us. So if we're actually, let's bring up an animation real quick. Go to anims, go to our idle and our base idle. So we can see our timeline here. It gets to the end and then it resets. So the speed at which we're playing that is essentially like if we were to crank up our frames per second as an example here. Now it's playing faster. Or now it's playing faster. Or now it's playing slower. And then whenever you hit that mark at the end, it loops back to the beginning. So that's essentially what we'll be creating here. So the mark at the end is set up by this node here. So modulo says when basically the accumulated time equals 1, we're going to reset it back to 0. And then it'll accumulate its time back to 1, then it'll reset back to 0. So it's kind of like this loop in this cycle that we're creating, or a timeline. So if we want that 1 to be slower, or for us to reach 1 slower, we can lower the speed. Another thing that you can do is you can up the amount of iterations here to say 5 or something like that. But I find that if you just stick with 1 and then you modify the speed, then that'll be an easier way of understanding how this thing loops. So the next thing we want to do is evaluate a curve. So we're actually just going to create some animation here. So on the evaluate curve, let's make this bigger. There we are. So we're saying anywhere from 0 to 1 for our source, which is this value coming into here. So this will be 0 and this will be 1. over time. So if we just treat it like a timeline, moving here, kind of moving left to right. And then when we get 1, we'll go back to 0 and then move left to right again. Then we'll hit 1 and go back to 0 and keep repeating. And then the values that we want are these values right here. So when you're at 0, what's the value? When you're at 1, what's the value? So we can just set up a curve to be whatever we want here. You can go beyond 0 and beyond 1 if you want. So like a negative value will be the opposite, and a higher value than 1 will essentially be like we're multiplying. But if we stick with just within 1, let's set this to 0 here. Let's add another key. So we'll right click, add key. We'll put this at 0.5, and then we'll bring this to 1 here. So now we're going to have a linear move as this speed moves our time and accumulates. We'll get to 0.5. We'll be at 1, which will be this value here. And then we'll get to 1, which is this value here. And then we'll be back at 0 because we've set our source minimum. If it's 0, which is here, I know it's kind of confusing, but our value will be 0. And our target will be this minimum here. So now what we want to do is just simply pull this out. We're going to say add. Then we're going to drive that here. So if we add this to say X, we can see what it's going to do. Actually, let's just go ahead and add a 50 value to X and play. So we can see that the weapon is now moved to the left there. And if we do negative 50, we can see that the weapon is now moved to the right. But if we drag this in here, we can see that it's not doing anything. Well, there might be something there with our spring interp and all that. But we are getting a value of 1 here when our source reaches 1. Okay. So again, as we move through time here, that's when we'll reach these values. So let's say that this has a maximum value of our 50 there. So now it should ping pong back and forth. So if we wanted to ease that out, we can hit 1 on all our curves, on all our keys there, and we can set ease in and ease out curve. So it kind of slows in and slows out of that 50 value. And then here, we can say, let's slow it down, 0.2. So now it takes longer for us to get to our 1 value on our modulo before it resets. And here, let's say negative 50. So it goes all the way to the right and now all the way to the left. Okay. So the next thing that we did, and you can make this curve be whatever you want, whatever you're looking for. But now let's do our forward and backward, which I believe will be our y. Let's look at y and let's do negative 50 again. Yeah. And then if we do 50, we can see that it's pushed in some. Okay, so on our y, we're going to do the same thing and bring that over, but let's give it a slightly different curve. So here we're going to say, we're going to add a key here. Actually, let's do this. Let's do 0.5 and 0.5. Then we'll add a key. We'll be at 0.25. Whoops. Every time I move my mouse. 0.25. I think I can do it over here too. Okay. I'm going to select that 0.25. I'm going to make it a value of, make this a little bigger. Nope, that doesn't help. Nope. Make this 1. Make this 0.5 be a 0.5. Add another key. Make this 0.75. And we're going to be a value of 0. So it's essentially the same curve, but we are just offsetting everything here. So I'm selecting our keys and hitting 1 to make them an auto tangent. Then we're going to just clean up these tangents here. And what we can do is just delete that key, so we don't have to clean up that tangent. So we'll hit 6 here to flatten these out so we don't overshoot. But you can overshoot if you want, it doesn't matter. So again, we're moving from -50 to 50, but we have offset timing. So we're hitting our greatest value first. So that's like we move this curve over 0.25 seconds. So if we play now, we should see, yes, our sword moving forward and backward, kind of in a circle, because it's also moving left to right. So now what we can do is take our last value here, which is going to be our up and down on our Z. So I'm duplicating these so that if you wanted to, you can say increase your speed here. So if we wanted to have this at 1 for Y, so you're going to go forward and backwards a lot faster than you're going to move side to side. So you'll definitely get a slightly different curve. Looks more like a sine wave. So it all depends on like what you're going for. I wanted something subtle. And obviously these values aren't subtle, but our timing is, or I should say our speed is. So what we can do, this one, zoom out a little bit, take these, whoops. I guess if you shift and left mouse click on the curve, then you'll add another key. So let's select all those, move it to the right a little bit. We'll come over here and just do that. So we'll put this at 0.75. We'll add a key with our hotkey now. We'll put it at 1, and that'll be 0.5 there. And then we'll add another key over here. Guess the same thing. We'll say 0. We'll say 0.5. And then add another key, just 1. We'll say 0.25 and 0. We don't need this. So again, select our curves, auto tangent, clean up our tangents here so that it loops and doesn't slow in and slow out on those mid keys. Delete that one and hit 6 here to flatten. Same thing, we'll add to Z here. We'll put it at 1 just so that we can see that speed. All right, now we've got the weapon moving up and down. Now, to add some variation to this animation, what I'm going to do is use some noise. So we're going to go 0.2 here. How did we do this over here? Let's see. So I've got noise values for our minimum and maximum, and noise values for our, okay, just our min max. And then, oh, the noise value on the speed. So the speed has a noise value. Okay, good to know. All right, let's come over here and set that up. So noise here. And we had one for min and max here. So let's get some real values here. So let's say negative 2. No, let's come back here and look. Okay, so I'm just setting a min max here, positive values. And I'm just doing the opposite for our minimum value here. So we're going to do a multiply here, not that one. Multiply. And that's going to be a -1. That's going to come in here. Then we're going to drag our straight value here. So if we say to -2, to say 2.5, -1, there we are. Then we can do that again here. So we get our forward and backward. Let's say we're looking at a 5 and a 10. And then we're going to do the same for our up and down. We don't want to go up and down too far. So let's say 1 and 2. And then we're going to play. So we've definitely slowed down the distance it moves, or decrease the distance that it's moving. And we added in some noise variation in there also. So if we were to say, watch this value, we can see that it's hovering between 1 and 2. We can slow this down to, say, the speed here. So if we say 0.01, maybe it's the frequency. So that's faster. It definitely looks like it's faster. Frequency, we're going to say 0.01. Speed, we're going to say 0.01. Okay. I think the flip is, how fast we're moving here also. So 0.01. So we're staying negative for a much longer time. Going up to almost -2 here. So yeah, you can play with these values there. Let's see what I'm doing over here. So we got a 0.1. I'm playing with some speed values here. So you can leave it as is. You can add in, where were we? Over here. Some more values there on the speed for noise or the frequency for noise. But overall, you just want something that you're happy with. So you can play with those values and see what you like. Let's go to 0.2 here. Let's go back to 0.1 and 1. we'll compile. We've got those values here, like how far the weapon is actually traveling, pretty low. The next thing that I'm doing is like you can individually, I set it up to individually scale those. So if you wanted to multiply just X or Y or Z on any of those, you can add it in. So say we can multiply here and put it here if we wanted to. So multiply, put it on X, and then we play. We play. Must have been playing already. Okay. So if we change this value to say 10, so we're multiplying whatever the result is by a value of 10. So we're just adding a 0 onto that distance that we're moving. Say 100. So now we're moving much further left and right. So you can see how you can also play with like the noise value here if you wanted to. So bring this noise over, multiply it by, let's say a 1 to 1.5. Then let's compile that. Then we'll play. So it's all subtle, but if we say 50 to 150, so just a way to get some variation in there. So I take a sip from my coffee. So like I said, it all depends on what you're looking for, but hopefully, you're looking at a way to add some some slight variation there into your animation here. You can change the speed values too, have these offset from each other even more rather than just the animation curve. So if you wanted to, you can duplicate those, pipe this in here like so. And that would be our translation setup. And then if we wanted to do, we move this out and make more room, we wanted to do one for our spring interp. We do here to Euler. So we're dragging out our rotation. We do an add here. Then we do to Euler. Sorry, from Euler. And then back into our spring interp. So here we're doing the same thing. So we could take these, duplicate them, move them up. We go to our add here. And then you can use these curves again if you want, which is what I'm doing. Or you can create new curves with new times if you want rotation and translation to be like completely different. You can switch up, like these curves aren't tied to like X, Y, or Z. You can put any curve on any of these multipliers and into any of these XYZ inputs if you wanted to. So now, so we can see this, we're times that by 50. We'll see that we're getting some rotation here now. So at the very least, you can see what it's doing. And then if we come here, go back to 1, we do 50. And then bring that back to 1. Here we go to 50. So we can see on our XYZ what our rotation is actually doing. So that at the least you can understand hey, how do I want these values to be adjusted? So that is the current setup. So that's the foundation of the current setup. So one thing I noticed that I didn't like is that if we play, here we are, and I'm looking to my right like that, and I'm sprinting, then the sword looks like, so if we do slow-mo, I cannot see that. Slow-mo 125. So we're running, we're sprinting. And I don't think this spring interp likes slow-mo, but we can see that our sword is clipping our hand. That's actually one thing I didn't like. If we're looking left to right while we're sprinting, not left or right, so that's left. I guess that hand might clip too. But one thing I did was here. So we'll bring this setup back in. So now that we've got our foundational setup with our animation, where are we? Here we are. Bring this over here. The next thing I'm doing is this little spherical pose reader. So how does that work? So let's hit play. We're going to we're going to use the cvar a.AnimNode.ControlRig.Debug -1. We're going to turn our debug on, and then we're going to say ControlRig.EnableDrawInterfaceInGame -1. So now we have our ControlRig debugs up in the engine while we're playing. So what we're doing here is we're essentially reading an axis off a certain bone, and we're saying, are you clipping this sphere? Yes or no? And if you are clipping this sphere, then output a float value. So if you are clipping the sphere, like if you're in this yellow portion here, you see how the yellow is lit up. If we come over here, we see that nothing's lit up on our head. So we're just looking at our head. So we can see that this little red indicator there, our debug line, that's red. And then we look to the right, and now it lights up blue, red, blue. We can also see that our sphere lights up yellow. So that means that we've at least contacted our sphere with that debug line. And the further away you are from this green portion, there we are. Okay, we got it green now. So now that green portion is lit up. So green means you'll have a float value of 1. And the further away we get from that green, the closer we go to 0. So when I just get there, we're basically at 0. And the closer I get to the green spherical portion, then we're a value of 1 now. So basically, like I said, it's like this alpha. I think about it like an alpha, but this float value is moving from 0 and to 1. So if we look at this value here, this is the head right here. So we watch this value. So we are at a value of 1 here right now. So you can see how we are moving further away from the green sphere portion and getting closer to the edge. And now we're 0 once we hit once we hit that edge. And then our debug line turns red. So that is essentially like an alpha. That's the way I look at it. How from 0 to 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. Okay, I think we got that. But let's look at that setup. So we have our spherical pose reader here. So we just want to do, I think it's easier to remember pose reader than spherical pose reader. We get the bone that we want. So let's drag this out here. So what's the bone? We want the head. So now we can see our debug line and where our sphere is. So let's go to editor preview. There we are. So this is the default. So where's the driver axis pointing? X is up. So that's likely up the bone chain. So if we look at the skeleton for the hero, we go to head, we can, if we know that we are in local, there we are, and I don't want to see bones, none. Okay, but we can see our axes here. So X is up. So 1 would be up on X, and that's the way that this line is drawing. So if we do -1, that'll be down. So just the opposite. So what I wanted to do was anytime my head looks to the right, I want to offset the weapon. So we need first this axis to look to the right. So if we go back to our skeleton, we see that Z in a value of 1 on our Z would be pointing to the right. So let's do that. 0 there, 1 here. There we are. But we're not looking to the right here. So really what I want to say is a value of 1 on Y. So if our nose essentially points over to our right shoulder, then we're looking right. But I want this cone to be over here. So let's see, our rotation offset, say 0 here. So here I'm just like playing with values. So that one just happened to work. So do 90. Let's try 90 on Y. So that's pointing down. And 90 on Z. Whoops. Oh, that's interesting. It's also on the right. So if you get rid of everything, it's hmm. Okay. So if we say 15, okay, so it's kind of like turning like a clock face. So -15 is clockwise, 15 or positive is counterclockwise. So anyway, we've got it into the right position. So if we were to say we're looking over there, we can see how our head now starts to clip that plane, that spherical object there, sphere. So we want to say now offset the weapon based off that position. But let's make this a little bit bigger. So let's say the active region size. So that's the green, and the fall off region is the yellow. We want the fall off region size to be bigger. So let's say 0.5. And active region is when we hit green there. So we can see that we are now looking right. So like there's not looking right. So we're just looking straight. And then once we move our mouse that way, we're starting to look right now. And depending on how big we want our green zone to be, we can make it go to a 1 value a little bit sooner. Depends on like how much we want to offset and how quickly we want to offset our weapon. Okay. So now what we want to do So we want to work with our animation here that we've created. So we're going to work with our translation. That's our scale. So we're going to take our translation, and we're essentially going to say, we're going to take our original translation and then add, okay. And then we're going to set our bone too. So we need that too. So we're going to set our bone location. From our control location over here, we want our translation. So we're going to pull that all the way over here and add. And then put that into there. So I need the scale here and the rotation from here. Oh, we wanted to keep our animation. So I'll grab the translation from our animation instead. Okay, so if we play here, whoops. We should still be receiving our animation. Okay, and we are. So what we're not doing is modifying our position based off our head orientation. So this output param again is a float value. So what we're going to do is that we have here, we're going to do an interpolate. So we're either going to add nothing or we're going to add something based off this value here. So we can see if we watch this value, then we play. So we haven't put in any values yet. So we come here. So we can see how we're at 1 here. So 1 will be 100% of whatever we add here. So let's say we want the weapon to move backward. What is that? Negative 50? Let's try that. There we are. So we should see that the weapon is further away from the body. Let's move this up. Let's move this up. And then let's use a negative 50 here, because I think that'll be easier to see. Negative, it'll be 0. This will be 500. There we are. So as we look to the right, our weapon moves away. So basically what we're looking for is, as we're running for this particular scenario, we want our weapon to be in a better position. So we're going to move it over, let's say negative 15, and back, say negative 15. And nothing on X, I mean on Z. So we hit Shift, we're looking right, and I don't see any more clipping. We can move it down to, let's say, negative 25. So now we moved it down. Now you can see that, like, when we're not moving, and I only wanted it to adjust while we're moving, just to get that weapon out of the way, we would need to only activate this if we're moving. So if you've been following along in my other videos, I already have a speed value that comes in here from our animation blueprint. We get our ABP hero. Open this up. And what we'll see is that I'm grabbing the speed value and piping that into our control rig here. So if we go to our anim graph, we will find somewhere, I believe this is it, our weapon sway. So here you can see speed is being piped in. So we go to weapon sway, we would create a new variable and call that speed. So you just click here, name it whatever you want, make it a float, and then you would make that instance editable here, which our speed value already is here. And then you can pipe in that value over here from your control rig once you check that here in your animation blueprint. If you come back here, we don't need this guy. And what we're going to do is say, oh, we'll just drag speed out here. Get speed, we'll remap, we'll clamp it. And we'll say our minimum speed is 0, so that's us standing still. Our top speed is our run speed, so 730. Sprint speed is faster. And then we'll say if we're standing still, we're 0. If we're moving faster or as fast as 730, then we'll be top -15. So we have -15 twice, so we'll do -15, -15. And then we'll duplicate that, type in our speed value, and then we'll say -25 here. So as we're standing still, we can see our float value will still change. So if we come here, do pi, see our float value is still changing, but since we're not moving, we're piping in values of 0. But then as we move, we get that change now. And we can exaggerate that by making this a 250. So as we move and look right, as the head kind of bounces in and out of that sphere, we can see the values change. We can see it visually on our sword too. So that's the setup I have over here, but I'm doing that twice. So there's, if our right shoulder hits a sphere, and then if our head hits a sphere, essentially the axis that we have aligned. I think I'm also offsetting our fall off rate region here. So up here we can say our active region, our negative width, 1.25. You can play around with these. I'm sorry, we want our fall off region, not our active region. So our active region is this green area, and our fall off region is this yellow area. So you can play with these values and see what they do. But I wanted, say, 1.25. You can see how that makes part of the region a little bit bigger. I'm not sure which one is which, so I'm just playing with those values here. 1.25. There we are. So that way, if you wanted to, you can make, say, that a little oblong or something, and you can have your region get hit a little bit sooner from one angle and less from another. So like say if we wanted negative height, I don't know what this is due, 5. Oops, 1.5. Okay, so that's the back end. But if we wanted that to be the opposite, so like 0.75, and it shrinks a little bit. So if your head's going all around and looking in 180, so you can play with those offsets there as you see fit. So to say get another value in here, we are going to add here. And this one was a little confusing for me to figure out. So we're taking both of these and adding them together. And then we're taking that final add and adding it to our original translation animation. So here's our original translation animation right here. Then we're going to take and say add here. So that'll be here, like that. And then we'll essentially get another interpolate here. So we'll duplicate this. So this value here will be the next cone that we're going to work on, or our next spherical pose reader. I know this is getting a little bit messy, but stay with me. So what we're going to do here, move those up. So now we're going to be adding more offset to more offset. And these are independent. So if I happen to hit this other sphere, so we're hitting the head. Here, if we hit the shoulder, then that'll start adding an offset already. And then we add those together. So say we're hitting them both. We'll add both of those offsets together to our original. We follow that line down. That's our translation animation down there. So if we duplicate this, Control Shift that over, then now we can say our clavicle left here. So now we have another pose to look at. But we want our offset to be, say, in the original position. 90, 0, 0, 90. So it looks like 180, 45. Where are you gonna be? Oh, I'm on the wrong one. That should be clavicle right. That should help. Okay, that's 90. That's 0. Let's see, will this one do anything? 90, there it is. So say 90 and negative 90. Nope, 90, 90. That's on the back there. I'm going to cheat. What were my values? Oh, 90 on X, 25 on Z, which probably don't need that, 25 on Z. So basically it's just on the back. And that just depends on like how big the fall off is. So let's say 0.35 and 0.15, something like that. And then we want our axes to be over here. We say 0, 1, -1. There we are. So if our shoulder rotates back here, let's get our fall off zone, say 1 and 1 and 1.5. This one's 1.5. There we are. So we're just stretching that a little bit. So if our clavicle comes and touches this zone, then we're going to be at a value of greater than 0. And the closer we get to our little green eye here, we'll be going to 1. So that is the value that will update here. And then it just depends on what we want to do with it at that point. So if we touch it, we say, oh, we want to move it back even further or higher. So it depends on what you're looking for. So we play. We see our 2 zones there. We zoom in. So if we try to get it over there, our clavicle is still red. If we run, then our clavicle goes from red to blue, so we're touching it. So our axis is touching that. We can see how much we're bouncing around there. And if we want to, we can make sure those values always move around. So if we're not moving, or if we're moving, we can just see kind of a shift. So it looks like we'll just hit it depending on like how much we're like really moving our aim offsets around, how fast we're moving. So if we move really fast, then we'll hit it. So if we make that 200 or something, then we'll really see it fly up. We move fast enough. There we are. So turn right, turn right. So we're just kind of slightly hitting that. So there's different ways that you can play around with that. You can have your fall off be, say, much greater, and your active fall off or your active range to be like much smaller, so that it takes you longer to get to a value of 1. You can adjust these values here too. So lesser values will move it less. So even if you are at 1, let's say you're only moving 5 units, which is obviously a lot less than like 200. And then you can hit like 2 zones simultaneously. So once you've added that, like if we wanted to add a 3rd zone, we'd add it here. And then we'd add it to our original animation. So we'd have a C here. We wanted another zone, we could duplicate all that, bring it in here, add another pose reader, output that parameter as our float that goes from 0 to 1 and gets our interpolate. So that is my final setup that I like. So here we'll make this a little bit bigger so that we can see little snapshots of our animation. Get this bigger still. We can zoom in just a little. So here's the final idle animation that I liked with our curve values here, what type of curves they are. And then I am taking those through a multiply for translation and a multiply for rotation on our spring interps. For our rotation, we're going from Euler and back to Euler to make those modifications happen. And then I'm bringing those values through. So we didn't do rotation, but it's the same thing. You're doing a rotational value based off your pose readers. So here in our pose readers, I'm setting, just for cleanliness, I'm setting some new variables, calling them alphas. So we got corrective pose clavicle alpha and corrective pose head alpha. And for both rotation adjustments and translation adjustments, I'm using those alphas there. So you can see the final setup in both rotation and translation and rotation. Looks like I'm going back to Euler and from Euler here. But basically, we are getting our original animation for rotation, and then we're adding in our offsets. So our offsets are added together because you can hit both offsets at the same time. We just want to add those numbers, and you want to be careful and look at how much you're offsetting. Maybe you're offsetting based off speed only, and you're interping from 0 to whatever values that we've had selected here. So here I've got very low values, 5, -5, 5, that sort of stuff. So here's the rotation pose offset, and then the translation pose offset. All coming into our final set transform bone. So I know that it seems complex, but in the end, it's a bunch of little things being put together and added on top of each other. And all those little things are more or less simple. You just have to understand what you're looking for. So hopefully you guys can see my final sway. So let's turn these to 0. Let's turn that to 0. See the final sway output. And maybe that can get you to add something to your game. Maybe there's like a little floating pet character that you want to bob up and down, and you want that animation to be driven here in the control rig rather than animating it by hand. And then you can adjust those values based off any amount of variables that you want to bring into your control rig. So hopefully you guys find that helpful. Happy animating out there, and hopefully you're enjoying that journey. Best of luck.